So today we have like the blurry landscape, blurry work environment, which is AI adding value to UX, and how this is going to be in the future. What new skills are required, are crucial for being competitive in the AI landscape today?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the first question to think about is whether AI is kind of real or whether it's hype. And, in the technology field, again, I've been in this for a long time, and there's always these waves of hype or something that comes out and it's announced as being big thing, and then it turns out to be a small thing. Sometimes it's a real thing, but just out in a corner. Now, this is not what I think about AI. I actually think it is real. But again, I will subdivide that into two sub-questions. And so the first one is AI a real major big change in knowledge work? And the second one is, are we going to have what some people call artificial general intelligence or AI that's like humans? Some people like Elon Musk, for example, I think last week said he expected that to happen next year. So that's a very aggressive prediction. And I'm not so sure about that second point. And to me, it's also not even as important, because why do we need a computer to be like a human? We have plenty of humans around already, and we know how we can make more humans very easily, right? So that's not really what's necessary. What's beneficial is something different, something that helps humans and uplifts humans. And that's what I think is in fact happening. And it's not just that I think it. I mean, there's a lot of scientific research evidence that it's true. Controlled experiments where variety of different researchers from many, many different places. And this is why I think it's very credible. It's not just one guy who did a study, but it's a lot of them. And they all have the same general conclusion. If you compare people doing some job without AI and with AI, there's a huge improvement in uplift in productivity. And the biggest improvement is actually for programmers, for software developers. So they more than double their productivity by using AI. Now, that's not us, but that shows you how big it can be. And for more general knowledge work, which is people like user experience, it's about a 40% improvement, 40. And that is a huge improvement. I mean, I've done many studies over the years about if we make a design better, can we make people, use the software better? Can they produce more output? And, if you get a single digit percentage, like 5%, 8%, you actually really help people do their work a lot better. But 40%, that is just enormous. And so that's why I think AI is actually real. It's a real change. And this is 40% with the current AI. And we know from just even like the last 2 years that improvements happen at a very fast pace now. It happened at a very slow pace for many, many years. AI was very primitive, and it got a little better and a little better, but it was useless for practical purposes, except for academic research. And then basically, I would say last year when GDP-4 was introduced, that's the first AI that was good enough to be really a true strong help for people doing work. And then we're expecting the next release to come out. And then is Musk correct that it's going to be like so super? That I don't. But I think it definitely will be better. So it's already 40% improvement in productivity. The other things we know, again, know from a lot of studies, not one study, but many studies, is it improves quality. It's not just people crank out bad work faster. They crank out better work faster. It enhances creativity. So many people said, well, yeah, AI may be able to do some pragmatic things, but it can't create new ideas. It actually can. It's more creative than 99% of humans. The very, very most creative, maybe not, but it's ideation is free is basically how I put it. We can just ask AI, give me 10 ideas, give me 20 ideas, and out it comes in a few seconds. And if you had to have humans, UX experts that are on a meeting table brainstorm, it would be hours of very expensive labor to come up with that number of ideas. Now, many of them are not going to be good ideas. That's a separate question. But again, the best of these 20 ideas is in fact a good idea, which is why quality improves. The other thing that improves is worker satisfaction, job satisfaction. People like working with AI tools. That leads to another change, which is if you ask people to sort of predict what they think about how good AI will be for their job, people have actually used it will give you much higher scores than people who have not used it but only read about it in the media. So the media coverage is sort of negative, but the personal experience of actually doing it is positive. And people, as I said, job satisfaction goes up because people don't have to spend so much time on minutia or less important things, and they can really move ahead with more creative work, more being in the flow. And that, but all of these things all require, kind of one big insight maybe, which is that it's a collaboration. It's not that you can say AI now does the work. AI improves the work of the humans. So my metaphor analogy is that AI is like a forklift for the mind. So it lifts the heavy burdens, but you still have to be like a forklift driver. You're going to go left and we're going to go right, those type of things. So it's like a forklift for the mind. Oh, and the last thing we also know from the data is that AI narrows the skill gaps. So skill gap is like we have somebody who's really great and somebody who's really bad at doing the job. So this is maybe the difference between those two without AI. So AI helps the really good person, they go up, but it helps the bad person more. And so there's still a gap. I mean, the best person, the best at some job is always going to be better than the worst at some job, but the difference is not as big. So it helps the weaker performers more than it helps the stronger performers. And so it's not egalitarian and it makes everybody the same, but it reduces the difference. So that I think also is positive. So all these things are data from actual studies, and not just one study, but many, many, many studies, many different fields. Some in UX have not been so many done specifically on UX people, but a few. But most of the studies are about other types of knowledge work, but a lot of very different types of knowledge work. And it's all basically from writing poetry to being, being lawyer to medical job diagnosis. I mean, there's so many different fields where it's all the same conclusion. So that's why I think it's real. And that's why I think that we've got to if you haven't started yet, you have to get started now. Start now. Start small, a small project, but start now. So depending on what time zone you're in, you can even start this afternoon if you're in the United States Pacific time zone, or otherwise, if you're in, let's say, Europe, you may have to start tomorrow, but start now is a very, very important point because it does take some experience to figure out how to really do this well. And so you have to kind of understand this notion of what can I delegate to the AI? How do I need to check on its results? Because the results are absolutely not perfect. But that's okay if you follow this workflow that I'm talking about, which is a collaboration. So AI, give me 10 ideas, human, of those 10 ideas, 5 are bad, 2 are maybe even wrong, and then maybe we're left with 3, and then you're going to prioritize which of those 3 that we're actually going to pick. So there are human elements that we need to retain, but we are uplifted. That's kind of that's the basic point. It's a collaboration, or synergy is another word for that.
And on top of I really like what you say that we need to start now. You cannot wait. Technology is going to eat everything. It's going to,
it will eat you if you don't do it. I really think that's true. And so we're now in year 2 of AI. So I said, I think that last year was year 1, which was GPT-1. Before that was like the prehistory of AI, which is very interesting for the history of science, but not so interesting practically. But we're now in year 2, right? So you're already behind anybody who's not doing it now. But what we really have to think about is not year 1, year 2. We have to think about year 5, year 10. And so anybody who's like kind of a youngish type of person, they will have anywhere from 20 to 40 years left of their career, depending on how young they are. And that's a long time. And so that's what you have to think about. You shouldn't think about this year or next year. You have to think about in 10 years, in 20 years. If you're really young, in 40 years, that's what you have to think about. That's going to be an enormous change. And experience, like with anything else, I think it's like experience accumulates, accrues. And so if you started last year, you already have a year's experience. That's the best. If you didn't, too bad. But if you start now, then next year you would have a year's experience, and that's worthwhile.
I remember I saw one bar graph you share in your newsletter with AI tools used by UX designers, and by far was ChatGPT the best, the more used one. It was 82%, 80% around the people is like insane amount of people using ChatGPT, which is the basic one, I will say. And then you have Midjourney, which is fair enough, with 18%, and then Perplexity, which is a new tool, right? There is tons of AI tools jumping in the market, and this year is going to be the boom again.
Yes.
It's never going to stop, in my opinion. But why do you think Perplexity is adding value to UX? And is there any other tool that is not yet, that has some hope in the future for UX, more towards in research phase?
Yes, I think there actually are. I do think, first of all, I want to sort of step back one thing and say, in terms of user research, I do think user research is research with human users or with actual paying customers. So some people are saying we can make, an AI kind of simulated user. I actually use that as my April Fool's joke in my newsletter that yes, we can do that, but I actually think no, we cannot do that. I think the main reason to do any form of user research, whether it's user testing or field studies, any method actually, is for the surprise. There's always surprises. It doesn't matter if, like me, you've done it for 40 years or you've 41 years or you just started now. It's going to be, there will always be surprises. And actually one of my kind of slogans is, if you did not get a surprise when you did usability study, it shows you did the study wrong, because you are just biasing the user so much that you get no surprise. But you always get a surprise if you run the study right. And so it's for that we really do it, the things we didn't know to look for that we find. And so I don't think we can simulate a user with an AI, even if it's a very intelligent AI, it's still not an actual customer. So, and that's the same with user testing. If you test the wrong users, you don't find out what your customers are doing. That's also useless. But that said, I do think we can use AI to help in user research, as long as we are in fact doing the research with the actual customers. And so, for example, a little bit lower down that rank ordering of various tools, there's a tool that's called Wondering, which is a funny name, but it's Wondering, Wonder. And that's a tool for doing user research, user interviews. So it's like you ask people questions. And so, yeah, I can ask a question, and depending on what the person says, I can maybe do a very smart, insightful follow-up. The AI can also do a follow-up, and maybe it's not quite as good if you compare it with a really skilled human interviewer. But the first thing I want to say is not all interviewers are actually skilled. So there's a lot of bad interviews where they actually ask leading questions and so forth. So that's one thing. But the second point is that it changes the nature of this qualitative research methods of interviews when an AI can do it. Because now we can conduct 100 interviews or several hundred interviews. We can conduct them in 50 different languages, which no human can. I mean, there's probably one person who can speak 50 languages, but basically no normal person can speak more than just a few languages. And therefore, if you do any kind of language-based research, which is actually almost all research, we depend on listening to what the people are saying. We're only doing it in a very small number of languages, usually actually only one. That's the truth. Most user research is only done in one language, the native language, or wherever the company is based. But now we can do it internationally, basically for free. It just comes with the point that it's an AI, means it can speak all these different languages. It can understand the user responding in all these different languages. It can translate it, and it can do kind of summaries. That's one of the things AI is great at. It just takes in, here's like 500 user comments. Boom, what's the 5 themes in that mass of data, which for a human to do it takes a long time. Now, some people will now say, well, the AI is not doing that analysis perfectly. To which I say, first of all, humans are not doing the analysis perfectly either. You always miss a few things. But the second point, which I think is more important, is I don't want to compare AI with the best possible human researcher doing a very thorough job, because that happens in 1 out of 1,000 projects. I want to compare with the other 999 projects, which either do medium quality research, that may be the 99 out of those 999, but the 900 of the 1,000 projects do basically no research, or at least they skip a lot of phases in this full process we have, the full UX process, user-centered design. And so that to me is what's important, is that we can, by making it efficient and faster, and for example, internationalization is something that people never study in, except for A handful of companies do this. And now everybody can do it. So those are things I think are very promising, is that broadening of the scope of UX. And I actually use this word pancaking, which is like you pour out the pancake batter and it just boom, gravity makes it flat and covers the entire territory being the frying pan. It covers the entire thing anyway, is my point. And the same, I think, is what we're going to do with UX. We will finally cover all development projects with a layer of UX, which will vastly improve usability.
How we can promote and elevate design thinking on an executive level today to keep design as a key consideration for design thinking, or not, sorry, for decision making?
Yeah. Well, I think that business is very pragmatic. It's really about, can you make money or not? And that is exactly what we now can. Well, we've always been able to do it, but it's also been relatively expensive. And that's the truth. User experience work is expensive and it's hand tailored. So if you think about, King Charles of Britain, like he always looks really good in his very good suits. That's because the king has like some very expensive tailor in London who hands makes every suit the king wears. Now, can every person wear that nice suit like King Charles? No, they cannot, because it costs a fortune to have one of the world's best tailors hand make a suit for you. So this is not realistic. And this is why, going back to the UX, this is why UX is often not done, because these executives sit and think, oh, I only have so much budget. How am I going to spend it? And then they're maybe not 100% convinced in all the things that people like me have been saying for many years about the return on investment. They see that the cost is high and they're not convinced about the benefits. So if we can cut the cost in half, which is basically what we can do with AI, I mean, right now, not quite, but again, if we think about, let's say 5 years from now, I would really predict we can cut the cost in half. And so that just makes it so much easier to pay for doing UX work. And then the other thing that happens is that because we have this vastly improved ideation, we can experiment with a lot of more, design alternatives, which is one of the parts of design thinking has always been, well, you diverge and then you converge, and so you're first supposed to spread out your ideation, but pragmatically speaking, again, it takes time and people have only a limited number of ideas when they sit around in a meeting. With AI, you can get a lot of ideas very quickly. Also, another thing that's coming is called generative UI, which is that not just generative, let's say, pictures or generative text, but generative, interaction, user interface design. And again, maybe not the perfect design, maybe not what the best design I would have made, but you can get 5 of them in a few minutes, and then you can test them with users, and then you can go back to human refinement to make it really great. So I think that is what we will see in terms of executive buy-in to UX is twofold, which is A, getting it cheaper makes it just much easier for anybody to pay for it. And secondly, magnify the outcome by exploring the design space more widely before we settle on a solution to implement. And this has always been the recommendation, so there's nothing new in that, but the pragmatic difference is how hard is it to follow this recommendation? And that's what's changing. So that's what's making it more achievable to both save money on the cost and achieve greater design impact, greater profits basically for the company. So they pay less and they get more. And that means that more people will want to do that. So, I mean, that's honestly how business works. If I had to pay a lot and I'm not really sure what I get, I will not be very excited about that investment. If I have to pay a little and I get a lot, wow, then I'm going to spend. And that's what I predict will happen.
How do you envision the UX roles, different UX roles like leaders, managers, directors, juniors, seniors, how they are going to impact for this changing?
Exactly. I think there's a lot of different changes that will happen. And the first one I just actually want to comment on, even if you didn't ask about it, which is potential unemployment. Because when I say we can do twice as much, each person can do twice as much, then some people say, oh, that means we can fire half the staff, which is true if all you needed to get done in the world was what was done in the past. But that is just not true. So therefore, it's also not the case that we fire half the staff when each person can do twice as much, because we will do many more things. I mean, it's not as if there's only a small limited need for UX in the world. I mean, the amount of bad design, or at least not great design, let's put it that way, mediocre design, is astoundingly large. So there's a huge unmet need for better UX. That the need has just not turned to a demand because the price was too high. With lower price, that need becomes demand, becomes more work rather than less work. So I predict actually more UX jobs, even if each person can do twice as much compared to the past. But what I do not predict, though, is I don't think we'll necessarily retain sort of the current approach where you have very centralized UX teams with many levels of management hierarchy, and you get promoted to, like, from designer to manager to director to vice president to senior vice president to chief design officer, big honcho type of person. I think there may be a few jobs like that, but I don't think there'll be as many in the future. So again, that's my sort of term of the pancake, and we go from a hierarchy to a flattening out of the structure. And so there will be more jobs of having a broader impact, and there'll be more jobs of, in the terms of career development, of developing really senior expertise and really understanding how to design better for a certain domain. So I think that there'll be these kind of architect roles, or very senior roles, but they may not be, oh, I'm like the vice president managing a division of 500, UX people. There'll be a few like that maybe, but I don't think there'll be very many. I don't think there'll be many like big agencies. I think it's going to be, I said, very spread out, very evenly distributed, very embedded is, and I get it as my key point. Now, what will this do to the junior staff? This is actually where I'm less certain about what will happen, because on the one hand, one of the things we know about AI is it's a seniority accelerant. So it boosts, as I said, it boosts the weaker performers more than it boosts the senior performers or the better performers. So that should help the junior people. I mean, they should be able to get going faster. They can learn faster. We talked before about something like Perplexity, which is a great way to get explanations that are contextualized to your situation. That's one of the reasons it's such a popular AI tool, that we can get explanations that are just for us. It's like custom written article. In the old days, I've always been writing articles, but they always had to be general articles. This is what I think in general. It's not going to be, what should you do right now? And things like Perplexity can actually help you more with that type of just-in-time learning. So that's another thing we actually know about AI, is that it accelerates learning. It's a great learning tool. And I think for society at large, there can be huge benefits from AI-driven education, particularly in kind of poorer countries where their education system is just terrible. That can be improved. I mean, again, it helps everybody, but it helps the people with the poor performance the most. But that's the positive view. But then there's a negative view as well, which is that with this pancaking and flattening out, we may get fewer of those type of apprenticeship positions that are actually, at least in the past, have been the best way to learn UX. I mean, you don't really learn UX very well at the university. I'm actually really appalled at the bad, education that the education system is producing specifically for user experience. Like, if you look at somebody who's like has a fancy master's degree and you ask them to do like just simple user testing, they will make so many methodology flaws. They will not pick up on, like, this is how the design should be changed. So they're usually pretty poor at that, even if they're smart, But then they learn pretty quick. If they are smart, they will learn quickly by working with some senior people who know how it's done. So apprenticeship, learning by being with the more senior people has always been the true way to learn UX. I mean, the true way to learn UX is not to get a degree, it's to actually work with some people who already know how it's done. And then you absorb that information from them. And I worry a little bit that learning style may not be as prevalent in the future. And we get, I mean, I even see it already now with some young people I talk to, like this notion of you go out and you become the only UX person in a company. That's great for somebody with 10 years experience, knows how things are done. It's not good for somebody with 0 years experience. So, I mean, it sounds great. Wow, I'm going to really own the user experience for this entire little new app that some startup is making. it sounds like a glorious future, but it's actually not good because it means that you don't know what you're doing. So you are just going off on random tangents. And I kind of call this being raised by wolves. You're being raised by these wolves out in the forest and something like that. You're not being raised by somebody who knows how to do it. And therefore you become kind of the wild savage type of UX person as opposed to a trained, skilled, good, high quality UX person.
I really love what you are sharing there, because actually, we and IterateUX, we are bringing more mentors. We believe strongly in how mentors will add value to our community. This is insane to see the potential that the senior or this mentor that we have here are supporting our community. They're growing with them. And they feel rewarded as well. So it's like a win-win situation. And the community itself is shaping with this orientation, let's say, right?
And that may be the way it works, and it works with mentors who are not in your same company, but in some other company who are willing to help out anyway. So that may well be the way this problem is solved, is like what you're doing. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. I think that is a good thing as well. And on top of that, there is a different UX professionals expertise and level, right? So you have that they are willing to start jumping earlier in their career to help others shape their, like fresh grads, to help upskills fresh grads or juniors, and self-taught, why not as well. So how would you see that those different UX professionals helping to the community?
Well, I think, as I said, I think it's a very important way of achieving something similar to apprenticeship. And I do think that when you marry it with AI, some of your maybe simpler questions, you don't have to bother the mentor with the simpler questions, because you can ask something like Perplexity and you can get an answer right on the spot. But there are a lot of things that are more judgment calls, and it's not so easy to just ask the question and here's the answer, but they're judgment calls, and they are it's sometimes one of the reasons it's called design is that there are trade-offs and it's not clear, because if it was clear what to do, it wouldn't be design, it would be implementation. So design is always trade-off. And that's the same with research of figuring out, well, you get a list of their users had trouble here, but why did they have trouble? What are the ways and what are the underlying deep issues? Which is why things like my 10 usability heuristics are still important, 30 years after I wrote them, is because they are these kind of basic things that explain the more specific things you observe. But teasing those things apart, that I think is one area where mentor can really be extremely helpful and helping you understand trade-offs and how you weigh relative importance, because some things may be important in this area, this may be more important, but in this other area, this other thing may be more important. So you can't really say whether A or B is more important, because it would depend on the context. And those are some of the subtleties that are harder to get right, and that require like some kind of discussion and the more in-depth understanding. Where again, somebody who is systems like ahead of you in the expertise development will be better at applying those judgment calls. And that's also why I think that where you grow in the old days, you had the growth was called the management ladder. I mean, there was many companies that, well, we have two ladders, but the main one that people were sort of saying, oh, this is my career, is I get promoted to another level of management. But the truth is that you have like being senior VP of an organization with 500 people, only one out of the 500 people can be at the top of that pyramid. So it's not really a realistic career plan for most people. But everybody can improve their expertise, and that is a realistic plan. Some will be better than others. This is just biology. This is how the world works. So not everybody is a genius, but everybody can improve. And that's what you should just aim for. And then the smarter you are, the more you'll improve. And that's how you extend your level of ownership. So ownership is maybe a better way of thinking about it than management level. So ownership is more of a design-oriented thing. So what level of design, or in terms of research on investigation and figuring out things, what level are you responsible for, you own? So you may own, but completely junior person may own nothing and only be assisting a more senior person. But no, pretty soon a junior person might own a very small thing, like, a button or something like that. You make this button happen, right? And you figure out what it should say. And then we test it. And if it was wrong, you learn and you write it better next time. So you start off by owning that very small thing on the screen. And then next time, you own maybe an entire screen. Next time you own a workflow or a feature design or an entire application. And eventually you own the user interface strategy for this company. So that's like the most senior person would be in charge of those very big strategic decisions. So there's the different levels of ownership, but you can own a very small thing. And in the beginning, there's probably as much as you should handle anyway. Whereas because you're not really yet sufficient experience to really do strategy. I mean, come on, people always say, oh, we should always do the deep strategy and the big thinking, but sometimes accept your level and accept you start with smaller things and then you do them very well and you expand, you grow your ownership to own bigger and bigger and more strategic things. And that I think is a very realistic career path for people to aspire to.
How do you feel about the balance between from the technical knowledge, between the technical knowledge and the practical skills? What is the difference? What is lacking there? Because currently the education system is more related to, the practical theoretical skills, right?
Yes. Oh, that's true. And I mean, I think you actually have to have in many ways all of the skills, and that's one of the ways in which AI actually is helping because it, as I mentioned before, it narrows the skill gaps, which means that things that in the past you would have been rather poor at, you can now get better at. You may not be brilliant or absolute super expert, but you can get better at it. This means you can broaden the number of things at which you are sufficiently good to do good work. And then sometimes good work is not enough. Sometimes you need absolute brilliance and the very, very best. And that's when you may have to turn to somebody who's an expert. But the truth is that most projects don't require that. Most projects are not like inventing a completely brand new thing. Most projects are more like design something practical that actually works well. And so for that, quite often, it may be good enough, the level of skills that you have, you can broaden out your skill base. And sometimes you may have to turn to an expert for advice, and sometimes you can do it yourself. I think that's another thing. I think it's nice if people could just accept their level and say, I'm pretty good, but I'm not the super expert. That means I can do most things, but not everything. And I think that's fine. And then you again aspire to continuous improvement for all of these things. But I do think you have to have a little bit of a broader understanding. And sometimes it's not that you actually personally do that job. For example, we turn to implementation and software development and all of that. I mean, this is absolutely necessary because if you don't have software development, you don't have a software product. But that doesn't mean that every designer has to be the coder and do all the programming. But it does mean that they have to understand what the programmers are doing because it's a collaboration and you've got to talk to them and be able to communicate in both directions. And so, yeah, they have to understand some of what the UX people do, even if they're not personally, the greatest designer or great doing user research, for example. That they're able to understand the outcome of those processes. But similarly, we have to understand how implementation is done, even if we don't go into the database and muck around and do a lot of those very advanced, complicated things. You have to be an expert to do, but we have to have some understanding of it.
What is happening with the design thinking process and how AI will start applying for each of those phases?
Yeah.
Let's say empathize, define, ideation, apply, and testing.
Exactly. Well, I think the rough process is probably the same because it's just kind of like the basic way that you design and understand people's needs. But what I think that AI changes is that it can accelerate some of the steps, and particularly can really accelerate ideation, which means that the diverge phase where you try many things can be broader. Also, I mentioned before, some of the early upstage discovery research can be cheaper, can be broader as well. So a lot of those diverge stages is where I think AI has a great potential for getting us to be more divergent, I guess, than maybe we were in the past. It was always said in the description of the process, so-called double diamond, that you go out and you go in, but how much do you go out? That maybe people didn't quite do enough, if I'm gonna be honest. So I think that's where AI will change it for the better. But the rough process, I believe, will still be the same because it doesn't come from a specific technology. I mean, that would be the same whether you're designing a website or a mobile app or a mainframe application of 50 years ago. People just didn't tend to do it that way back in the old days, but they should have. So, so that process is not really dependent on the technology. It's not really dependent on the tools. It doesn't say if you're using Photoshop, you do this, and if you use Figma, you do that. No, you know, those are that's a separate level of consideration, and you should definitely use the most efficient tool that's available at any given stage of technology development. And there are now going to be more and more AI tools, but the basic stages will be the same. It's just that I think that we can do more efficient work, and that accelerates it and makes the outcome better. And as I mentioned a while ago, that means that companies will be more willing to pay for it.
The idea of of a synthetic customer. And, you had mentioned and touched upon this idea of, AI accelerating learning, accelerating the flattening out of a skill set. When you say no, why is it a no? Because if you're able to take the quantitative data of a particular group of people and subset that under an LLM, and get a general idea of that customer segment,
Right.
and ask that customer segment into an LLM and get something back. When I'm saying LLM, I mean large language model for those. Why aren't you able to get a generalized view of what that customer might think?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can probably get what you said, a generalized view of what they think, but I don't think you necessarily get the very specific, very contextualized view of what they do in the moment of a specific action. And that's where often those surprises happen. And there are two types of surprises, but they're positive and negative surprises in some ways. So there's the positive surprise where you get this insight that, wow, this is an opportunity for a new feature or for a new thing we can do to support these customers that they never thought to ask about. This is why one of my old slogans has always been, don't go by what the customers tell you, because they don't know what they want. I mean, they may know what they'd like to ask for, but that's not what they actually need. But if you observe them, you sometimes see, ooh, this is something that can become my new product. And that, I think, is best likely to come from these kind of generalized insights. And then there's the negative surprises, which is people go off on some tangent and they're lost in the woods and they just use your product in a completely wrong way because there's something in the mental model that's not right. And that's not, or that should not say right, because of course the customer is always right. I mean, but you thought that they would have this way of doing it and they had this way of doing it, and that goes off in outer space and your entire product is a failure because of one little stupidity. And I always say it's the designer stupidity, not the user stupidity, but it's a mismatch is really what it is. And those surprises, I doubt you will really find. But that said, I mean, that doesn't mean that you cannot do anything. It's a little bit back to the heuristic evaluation I came up with, which is that we have started these packages of lessons from many user studies in the past that says that people only have so much memory capacity, and those are general lessons, and those we can certainly apply. I think right now, the lessons from current AI is it's not actually quite good enough for this nuanced thinking to truly apply the usability heuristics well enough. This doesn't mean that it could not maybe do that in 2 or 3 generations from now. But I've also always said that even though I wrote down these 10 heuristics and all that, that's not my recommendation for the only thing you do. It's my recommendation you use them as one way of thinking about usability. And then you also watch customers use your product or use prototypes or design ideas and so forth. And again, with AI, we can make these design ideas, prototypable or whatever you want to call it, like a generative UI can make these design ideas instantiated more cheaper. So I still am a really firm believer in that, of making something that's sufficiently tangible that the customer can interact with it. Not necessarily they can do their full job, but they can at least kind of do a simulated session. So simple prototype. And then you will get those two types of surprises, like the positive surprise of a new idea or the negative surprise of, oops, it's got to go different because people are using it the wrong way. And the surprises, I mean, it's hard to say what percentage of the inside are the surprises, but it's certainly a big enough percentage that I would really worry about losing my surprise ability from real customers. But on the other hand, surprises aren't everything. I mean, the surprise is surprise exactly because it's an exception. There's also a lot of things that are just like, okay, yes, this we know. if you show so many options, it's going to overwhelm people and so forth. And that's the type of thing I think AI can possibly, in 1 or 2 generations, I probably think 2, but at some point in time, will be able to help you with those type of analysis.
So, for example, what do you think the customer will be able to adapt to, say, a generative AI product? So, for example, we already have Netflix as one of the common streaming services right now. How often or how soon do you think a consumer will be able to adapt to, say, not necessarily a touch functionality, but similar to a just heat mechanism? For example, there are products out there that can touch on your different levels of heat preferences, right? But you have to integrate that yourself. How often or how soon do you think it'll be where you walk in a room and then it just detects your body heat and adjusts the room temperature to what you previously had?
Yeah. Well, I think that basic usability is really the same, whether it's AI or not AI, or whether it's virtual reality, or whether it's 5 other technologies. And so I think with all of those technologies, you can make a user interface that's complicated and where users don't understand what's going on. But you can also make better design. And actually, there was a good analogy from the very good old days, which was the graphical user interface, which in general is a big improvement in usability, but only in general. And there were absolutely terrible designs that came out for early Windows that were bad graphical user interfaces. And actually, some people did like a nice study where they compared line mode text only user interface to a Windows-based user interface for certain applications. And the old school design won because it was more smooth and polished in its interaction. But that said, the potential for designing great user interfaces with graphical user interfaces, Macintosh, Windows, those things, is much higher than for Unix and DOS and those things. So a great DOS program will beat a terrible Windows program, but that's not a reason to not move from text-based to graphical user interfaces. Similar here, a great non-intelligent, non-AI application will be easier to use than a terrible AI application. It's not because you put AI in it that it becomes great. It just gives you new potential that you then have to design well. And I actually think absolutely we can design it well. We have these interesting questions about controllability. Like the user needs to be in control. That's one of my really strong, it's actually more of an ideology than anything else maybe, but I do have this ideology that humans need to be in control of technology, not the other way around. But sometimes that can be done by the computer being just such a perfect servant that it predicts your needs, and you don't have to order it around. I mean, that was the old school, was command-based user interfaces, and it was very oriented towards making the commands easy to understand. That was our big usability challenge. And discoverability, which commands are available. Once you've discovered them, can you then use them correctly? The feedback, can you tell the result of the command what it did? Those were all important usability issues in command-based interactions. And now with AI, it's intent-based outcome specification. So I don't tell the computer, do these 5 steps. I tell it, I want this. I want a picture of a monkey on a bicycle eating a banana, whatever things you want it to make. You tell it what you want, not how to do it. But you still have to tell it what you want. Sometimes maybe you don't even have to tell it what you want. Sometimes, as your example, maybe it can kind of sense in some ways what type of temperature you prefer and adjust automatically. But then if it doesn't get it right, and again, you shouldn't expect that it will always get it perfect. So how can we then adjust for it? And the adjustments then require the user to understand what's going on. And these mental models can, as we know, they can be a bit hard to get right, which is one of the reasons for a lot of usability problems, is that people have a wrong model of what the system is actually doing. So communicating how it's working, and those are usability concerns. And I feel like those are not necessarily the identical design question, but sort of more fundamentally, it's a similar style of design questions, or making people understand what's going on, making them understand what options or choices they have for effecting a change. And so that's also why I think that there's a lot more to happen in AI. I mean, some of these advances are technical advances. We're definitely not done at all with the technology improvements, but some of them are usability improvements, design improvements, UX improvements. And so we can make users, people, better at mastering these tools because they're not well designed right now. I mean, this is, to be honest, I think it's a disgrace, honestly, because we do know how to design better, but that knowledge has mainly not been applied to all of these kind of the bigger of the tools anyway, because they were developed purely based on the technology. But that is just history repeating itself. This is how it has always been. I said, I've been in this area for 41 years, always been the same. New technology comes around, and the first few generations of products are just based purely on engineering and technical mandates, and not based on our knowledge or our skills and how to design for humans. Then we come around and fiddle with it and make it better, right? And so, sad to say, I'd hope for better this time, but no, it's the same this time around as well.
I can't wait to ask you my question. I live very deeply in the design system world, so a lot of documentation, consistency, things like this that can be pain points in a design system. And so my question is, how do you see AI intersecting with design systems? And then strategically speaking, what would be your recommended starting place for teams that are not already leveraging AI with their design systems to actually start doing so?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. And I think, first of all, I think that the concept of design system is just as important. And again, AI doesn't change the basic points of most of what we do. What it can change is potentially that it has really a perfect memory. So it knows all, well, if you train it on it, it will know all elements of your design system, and therefore it'll be able to bring them to the forefront at the appropriate point. And as you point out, consistency is so key. And humans are unfortunately not really good at this because we only have so limited, memory and all of that. And we cannot, even things we do remember, they don't always come to the forefront of our minds at the proper time. Then the next week you remember it maybe, and then it's too late. And computers are, this is one of the things computers are good at. It's just like remembering everything. So I feel like those are areas where design systems can be better. And there's probably also a bunch of just implementation issues as well, of managing these big libraries of things. I'm not completely sure exactly what techniques to use or exactly what products to use. I also think, by the way, this is where likely there will be a lot of new products coming out, because we mentioned earlier in the session today that there's some general tools that are very widely used among UX, but there's not so many specialized tools. But we know from the general history of UX, there's been a lot of specialized tools emerging over the last, let's say, 20 years or so. And so I would predict the same will happen with AI, that it starts permeating everything more. Now, there are two ways that can play out, right? It can either be the existing tools add AI, immersion, or entirely new tools come out, which I maybe believe in a little bit more, because it's sometimes easier to design something, or you get a better result anyway, if you design something with the capabilities integrated from the start, if you try to put them in after the fact. But both are possible futures. So I'm not going to say which one may necessarily be happening. But I'm actually very excited about the potential for design systems to have much more impact, and also to be more widely used. That's a little bit repeating an argument I already made, which is that if it becomes cheaper to do something, then more companies will do it. So I think right now you need to have a lot of specialized experts like yourself work on it. And that's great for the companies that can afford to do that, because you get good work out of experts. But you may also be able to do it in more places if it becomes something that is faster and cheaper to do. That's just how the economy works. If something is cheaper, it gets done more. So those would be my various predictions for your specific question.